Facilitator, colleagues of the manufacturing endeavor, thank you very much from the Department of Water and Sanitation for the opportunity to address a very important platform. Chair, I also believe it's very much in order to offer an apology from the colleagues, especially Dr. Makta Luktalam, who couldn't make it today, and it was planned that she would do this presentation. I'd also hoped somebody more senior might have been able to do it. I was hoping some Hapu delegation might have worked, but unfortunately not. And so I get the opportunity to do this presentation on the NWRS2, but fortunately I've been exposed to it and I've been familiar with that for quite a long while. I was just telling my dear friend, Mr. Chris Fenimore over here, 1 hour today is going to go because it's one of the coldest starts I've had. I only managed to get a printout and a copy of the presentation an hour ago. So let's indulge me, and I'll indulge myself, and we'll have a little bit of fun this morning. So Chris said, maybe you should just start off by talking about the weather. And I said, you're right, it's a fantastic idea. So aren't we all very grateful for this wonderful rain that we are receiving in KwaZulu-Natal? I think you've had a presentation on some of the water reconciliation scenarios. People are very aware of the current crisis that we're facing within KwaZulu-Natal, particularly within the eThekwini region, Ilembe and Ugu. The dam levels in Hazelmere, they sit at 27%. A few months ago, we would have run out of water in August, but through some interventions, we were able to extend that water, and it's now going to take us at least until October. Previously, we were using 1% over 4 days. We're now using 1% of the dam level between 7 and 9 days. So there's fantastic progress. So within the local government, domestic sector, things have been happening. Big question is, as you've been addressing and what you're focused on in the last yesterday and today is, can we be actually doing the same within our industry or manufacturing sector in terms of water savings, water efficiency? I also noted one of the themes that you've also been dealing with is energy efficiency. And I also noted I'd come in quietly, and I decided to just keep my hand down. So, Dr. Valerie Naidu, thank you very much for the honorary status of Water Affairs Official in dealing with some of the queries. But colleagues, at the end of my presentation, feel free to pick up any questions you have. If it relates to the presentation, I'm comfortable. If it doesn't relate to it, I might be even more comfortable. So feel free at the end of the presentation to raise any issues or queries that you may have. I've also begged the indulgence of this meeting and also the chair for a few extra minutes, hence I can take my time just to get warmed up as I am right now. So colleagues, yeah, it's a very exciting opportunity and I'm very grateful to be here, so thank you very much. If we could just, let me see, there we go. Very briefly, in terms of what we'll be dealing with, it's the introduction. We're going to specifically focus on the NWRS2. In the course of questions and discussions, I also noted there was quite an emphasis and focus on what is agriculture doing. So I'll also get an opportunity to touch and share with you what is being done within the agriculture sector, because in terms of the rollout of the NWRS2, we're looking at rolling out on a sectoral basis. So we would be dealing with business, mining, industry under one category, and then we've got a few other categories which I'll highlight in the course of my presentation. There we speak to the implementation approach, the progress in terms of what has happened so far. The WSS is the Water Services Sector Leadership Group, not too critical to us, but I think we need to touch on it to look at what kind of institutions and organizations can get involved, can influence, and move the directions in which we take, particularly within the industry or the manufacturing sector. What would be the way forward around the implementation? And I think in that regard, it's very critical for this sector because we're going to be asking you in a partnership, how are you going to be engaging us? How will we be supporting you? And how can we together, collectively in the sector, move forward? If I have an opportunity, time-wise, Chair, and that you are allowed to dictate to me whether I can present a little bit on the drought, but if not, I'm also very comfortable to move on from that. So just speaking to the NWRS2 and to give it some context, obviously, it is a specific requirement under the National Water Act. There's a legislative requirement to produce a national water resource strategy, and that strategy should be reviewed annually, but a new strategy should be developed every 5 years. In terms of developing that, there's some very fundamental critical principles or issues that need to be addressed in these processes. And then they also include, for instance, the critical need for the consultation, and I'll touch a little bit on that in terms of what we have done. The strategy has been redrafted to take into account the various comments, and this has also been aligned to the governance objectives in terms of existing frameworks, but also I think for all of us in terms of a critical guideline framework and document for South Africans, the National Development Plan. The strategy was finalized in June 2013. Since then, a number of other issues have emerged. For example, some of the policy issues, and there's a very clear indication. There's 12 new principles in terms of policy principles that were adopted by Cabinet in 2013 of December. Then in terms of our engagement internally on how we were dealing with it, we have identified the various chapter leaders, and we also have identified sector champions in terms of engagement. As I'd indicated to you, in terms of implementation, we'll be adopting a sector approach. We will have DWS sector leaders. We will also engage with existing platforms, and there is an existing platform in terms of the Water Services Sector Leadership Group. And then, of course, one of the very critical areas we've identified broadly, not to your sector in particular, maybe less so in your sector, but the issue of around skills and capacity and the expertise to be able to perform what is required. Just in terms of, I know we've touched on it already, and a few colleagues have made a few comments around the resources issue. What is the vision in terms of what we want to do going forward? So for 2030, the vision is we must have sufficient water resources. Water must be provided for growth and development. There has to be an acknowledgement and understanding, and I think it's already been highlighted by the previous speakers, that we are in a water stress situation. And in fact, if I was able to put up a slide within KwaZulu-Natal, and if we looked at all of our major water systems, you'd find approximately half of them that are already under stress, effectively meaning the water that is required is exceeding the amount of water that is effectively available within that system. So that would then describe as a system as being stressed, not having adequate resources to be able to support what needs to be done. Very clearly, and I think it's a very obvious statement, water scarcity threatens energy production, food security, economic growth, and ultimately the quality of life. This strategy will also address current and future water demands for 2030 vision, and at the same time ensure sustainability around the use of our water resources. There is a very critical alignment and linkage to the National Development Plan. And as indicated in the slide, our NWRS2 is very clearly now aligned to this National Development Plan. That is also in terms of the National Water Act. And just a couple of comments, and maybe while I'm going through these slowly, and if you've already read through, just take a note of what comes up in the National Development Plan as some of the key issues that need to be addressed. So water supports development, and it's meant to assist us with the elimination of poverty and inequality. I'll reiterate the issue of inequality as we go along. Water contributes to the economy and job creation. Water is protected, used, developed, conserved, and managed in a sustainable, efficient, and effective manner. Well, I think I've dealt with those last 2 points. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I just to take the opportunity to highlight one or two of the key things. These are, you'd note, we go through all these various numbers. These are the key issues that have emerged as the highlights, and these need to be addressed and focused on in the NWRS2. And maybe if I can, you would just identify, these are the key objectives that need to be met, and I think we've already touched on those. What are the strategic themes that have been identified? And for me, the very critical one is on the water conservation and water demand management, and I think we've touched a little bit on that. And then how is it to be effective or effectively implemented in terms of execution? We will look at institutional arrangements, the financing, the monitoring and information management, research and innovation, and I think we've been very fortunate to have Dr. Valerie Naidu address us this morning, and very critically so, the water sector skills and capacity. Just very quickly, just an image to graphically, through a pie chart, indicate to you our water usage within South Africa, and I think of significance to us would be the industrial component, which is 3%. We can look at mining as another 3%. Power generation is sitting at 2%. The domestic use is sitting at 24%. And I think what we do need to note is that currently 60% of our water is being utilized in the agriculture sector. What are the major priority areas? And these are actually also included in that very busy slide that we spoke to a little earlier on. And I think it's very critical. It's the achievement of equity and water allocation reform. They've got a very nice, abbreviation for this WAR. So it's WAR, Water Allocation Reform. And I think they're really developing and addressing it as battle strategies almost. So it's an interesting analogy. And of course, very critically, water conservation and demand management, institutional establishment and governance. For those of you, well, wherever you are in the country, you will be beginning to understand the department is in the process of rolling out catchment management agencies, and they will have a very critical role to play in the management of our water resources. So yeah, that's also a very important element. It's also emerged that there is a very strong need on our part to have a very strong compliance monitoring and enforcement focus. For far too long, you know, we've been engaged in the sector. We've had several breaking of rules, regulations, etc., and there's been attempts to engage it. But this time around, there is a very dedicated focus with allocation of serious resources into compliance monitoring and enforcement. Not to threaten you guys. I'm just hoping you guys are fantastic people, always legal and above board anyway. But if you're not, watch out. We are on our way to you. Then, of course, very critically, the planning, infrastructure, and development. I think in as much as I'm prejudiced towards water conservation and demand management, one must always appreciate there is a critical need for infrastructure, there's a critical need for the maintenance of the existing infrastructure, and without a doubt, going forward into the future, there's still going to be a need for infrastructure. I think the key point is over here, how do we marry an appropriate and critical mix of both supply side and demand side measures in terms of managing our demand and the use of the water resources. I'm not going to speak to O&M. That's one of the areas we've fallen critically short, particularly as local government. We find many of our systems collapsing due to the lack of investment in O&M. So there's an increased emphasis on O&M. There were constraints previously on the part of Department of Local Governments and Traditional Affairs, and even Treasury. They were reluctant to release money for O&M. But I think people have increasingly recognized that shortcoming is really a critical shortcoming, and we find increasing allocations and availability of funding towards the O&M components of that. My apologies. Some of the key principles and the approach to the implementation regarding the NWRS2. It is a participatory approach, and I think that has been reiterated. You'd find most legislation that has been developed post-94, there's a very critical element that emphasizes and insists that you conduct appropriate consultation. And I don't mean just throwing an advert in the paper or putting up some information somewhere, but it means a real engagement with stakeholders and citizens. Partnerships, as has been indicated, partnership with private sector and civil society. The success of the NWRS2 is critically dependent on all stakeholders and not just the public sector. So this is indeed the most appropriate platform and forum to be addressing in terms of engaging and hopefully enticing our colleagues in the private sector to take us hand in hand around some of these issues. I'll address and touch on something called the Strategic Water Partnership, which is a partnership between government and business, and I'll show you how private sector can make a very significant difference, even not just within your own sector, but actually impact upon what is going on within the domestic sector. So I do believe that industry and the manufacturing sector in particular might be in a very ideal position to engage as a partner and possibly even as a contributor towards engagement and solutions to this particular sector. Good governance, which includes transparency and accountability, equity, responsiveness, predictability, integrated sectoral planning, and I think we've been speaking to this, and this has been the approach. Of course, critically is also the clarification of various roles and responsibilities. We want to be effective and efficient in what we're doing. We don't want to try and avoid waste of resources and duplication of effort. There's also a critical need. That's a very nice, I like those three words. Centrality of water in planning, or is it 4 words? or 5 wards, whatever it may be. So often we can plan a housing development, or we can contemplate buying a piece of land to put a manufacturing setup onto a place. Have we actually gone on to check the availability of water in that particular area? Is the Water Services Authority in a position to supply you the water in the quality and the quantity that you require? And similarly in housing projects, sometimes the construction's almost finished before they approach the municipality to say, we need water services in this area. And because you don't have water services, you can't occupy those houses. And when you're not occupying those houses due to social process and pressure, people sometimes go and forcibly occupy those houses. Now you're creating social and political strife as well. So you can just see how critically linked many of these factors actually are. So we're saying whenever you're planning anything, water is a central issue. Even if you're planning a new farm, you've got to take into account what are your requirements? Are they actually available to you? If not, is it viable for me to get it via some other way? If not, then let me look at an alternative site. So for me, that's also a very critical element in terms of centralizing water into your planning. The NWRS2 implementation framework will guide the development of the implementation plans in order to operationalize the NWRS2 strategy. This has also been developed in a collaborative manner with various sector stakeholders and water users, and this is reflected in terms of both water use type, the groups, and of course, as indicated, we've always adopted a strong sector orientation. Just to give you a pictorial indication of some of the categorization and the interface between the various themes, if you look at the thematic issues, and we've touched on some of those, and they include water conservation, demand management, the principle of equity, planning, infrastructure, those that we've just touched on, those are the thematic. With regards to the various sectors, we have local government dealing with the domestic sector, agricultural use, energy. When we speak to mining, and I think we need to put business in this particular instance, the manufacturing sector, then we have private, and obviously we also have skills. In terms of institutions, Planning Commission, they produced the National Development Plan, which we're all working to. The South African Association of Water Utilities, your kind of Umgenis and Umhlatuzi water boards, for our colleagues from Gauteng, your Rand Waters, from colleagues from the Free State, your Bloem Waters, colleagues from the Eastern Cape, your Amatola Water, etc., etc. SALGAS is for the South African Local Government Association. They've been very critical in our engagements, and there's a very strong, close relationship. Indicated to you the Strategic Water Partnership Network, WSSLG and others. In terms of spatial, of course, in our NWRS2, we have a range of areas and spheres of engagement and influence. Of course, we share international river boundaries with our neighboring countries, so there's obviously an international perspective. We are also committed to certain international conventions, which we are obliged to also fulfill. So the international issues come in, then we deal with our provincial priorities, focus on developmental nodes, the 24 priority districts. That was a presidential initiative where there were critical issues, critical challenges, critical problems. Those 24 districts were identified for specific and special intervention. Unfortunately, I would say almost all of the district municipalities within KZN fall as part of that 24. So it is not necessarily a good reflection, but at least we have a realistic understanding of the challenges that are currently facing us. And then, of course, at community level. The implementation of the rollout and what has been happening so far. Colleagues, I'm not going to take too much time on this particular side, so I suggest you go through it as quickly as you can. I'll just maybe touch on a few highlights. Just in terms of the dates, the DG approved it at the end of December 2013. We can speak to a range of issues, workshops that have taken place, the various sectoral workshops. They give you a clear indication when we had the draft sector plans were available. We've dealt with the issue of the comments. We've taken account into those comments. And where they've been critical in terms of being able to take forward the debate, we've included some of those recommendations. And I think the key part, if we can look at under 2015, is to finalize the consolidated implementation plan and associated monitoring framework. I attended a meeting about 2 weeks ago that was specifically addressing that. In terms of the consultation meetings that have taken place, we've obviously engaged with the agriculture sector, and these are the organizations that we've engaged with. On the energy sector, that's clear. Mining, we've met. And then on the private and the business side, and I think I'll just take a few seconds to go to this, we've had numerous meetings and conference calls with the Strategic Partnership Network, that is the SWPN, which I've touched on. And then we also have an energy-intensive user group that we've been engaged with directly as well, and the higher levels of business representation via BUSA, the Business Unity of South Africa, and there's also the Black Business Council. Then the others would include obviously local government and going through a range of all the others. We've also had obviously where we've engaged all sectors in terms of a geographical area. Capacitation workshops were held for the officials within the department to gear up in terms of the rollout. We've had various sector meetings, and we've had provincial multi-sectoral workshops. And by the way, we will also have, yet again, so wherever you go back to, there will be these further provincial consultation workshops around the implementation plans for the various sectors as well. Okay, this is just touching on the various sector and the theme implementation plans that have been developed. Let's go. There's the one that we need to focus on a bit more. Just in terms of the private sector and the business and mining, urban, forgive me, am I drying on my batteries? Oh, there we go, let's see, there we go. Infrastructure development, planning and the O&M components, it's engage in water for urban development, water reuse, and I've heard people speak about that. AMD stands for Asset Man Drainage, and I think even in that area, I would imagine WRC might be involved in some of the research together with the department on the possible reuse of that water, because you're developing plants to treat it and extract heavy metals, et cetera, and I think as it is with even, for example, in eThekwini, and you've got your Southern Treatment Works, you're treating the water anyway. And it's just a few additional steps to get it to an appropriate quality for either reuse within the industrial, commercial sector, or alternatively as actual drinking water quality. And maybe I must just take a second or two to share an example. I know eThekwini was looking at the feasibility study of treating and reusing water directly into the drinking water system. And I understand perfectly clearly the water that's produced at the Southern Treatment Works is of adequate quality for drinking. I remember when I first got to KZN, and it was then Minister, it might have been Ronnie Castells, and it was Neil McLeod who was the head. And we went out to do a tour around this works. And at the end, we came back, and there was this huge beaker that just captured water in terms of the final water that was coming out. And I merely saw some of these very high-ranking officials just pour this water into their glasses, say cheers, and bottoms up and down the hatches, and they just drank the water. And I must admit, at that point in time, I was extremely hesitant, whether it was for personal reasons, cultural reasons, religious reasons. Ugh, it just gave me the EBGBs. But also being a scientist and also being an official, I had to also appreciate and understand the reality of the situation. We are dealing with a very finite resource. We're dealing with a limited resource within our country. And what is our reality? If you look at Namibia, for the last 50-odd years or so, they've been using that same recycled water. As much as 70% of the water that's treated goes straight back into the drinking water system. Now, I know within eThekwini, as we were proceeding with the feasibility study, a few people kind of woke up late. No, you can't do that. And they've kind of put a spanner in the works. And that is kind of on hold at the moment, and they're hoping together with a few other engagements we can unblock that process. But lo and behold, we're now going through this drought crisis out in Ilembe. They've already implemented forcible 30% restrictions. The Caesar Water Sepcom, which is also a service provider to Ilembe District Municipality, made a proposal. We can treat our water to drinking water quality standard, SANS 241 or whatever it is. What is it? 241, thank you. And it's appropriately adequate. But of course, they can't do it and release it into the system until there's a process that has been followed. And we as a department was very hesitant given the eThekwini experience. But lo and behold, the feedback on the ground and the experience on the ground is yes, as consumers, we are prepared to use this water. We are prepared to drink this water, and whatever it takes, we will use it. So I think we must begin to understand and begin to change our mindsets about how we approach our resources. Of course, they've already made that water available for reuse to road construction and other business who can come and cart it away. So there's an example on the feasibility around this issue of treatment and reuse. And I know there was a query earlier on, and I thought I'll take the opportunity to touch on it. Colleagues, one of my passions, without a doubt, is water conservation and demand management. We need to be looking at practical interventions. We need to go beyond talking. We need to be looking at interventions in all of our sectors, not just in the domestic sector. Of course, they are one of our key users, so we need to engage them. It's just that, and I think maybe from an industry and a manufacturing perspective, water is one of your raw resources. It's one of your inputs in terms of what you ultimately produce. And at the end of the day, it costs you money and it affects your bottom line. Historically, we might have been able to have access to this very cheap water and cheap electricity, but that scenario has changed over the last few years. And you're going to find it increasingly so even within the water environment. Whereas in the past, water might have been a marginal cost or input cost into your production processes, it might even become a constraint. It might even actually limit you. So in terms of that, there is a very critical need for the manufacturing sector to really engage. It needs to look at benchmarked processes, similar processes around the world. You don't need to necessarily limit yourself to the experiences that are just occurring within this country. There are numerous exemplary examples around the world that could be emulated in terms of production processes. There are some fantastic examples. I was very fortunate to be a part of an initiative a few months ago, and it's a geographically based initiative on the Durban South Basin. And together with the area-based management team, which is a part of the municipality, they wanted to get all businesses within this area to focus on water conservation and water demand management. What a noble initiative. And for me, it just got my juices flowing. And I said, please, anything I could do, I'm very happy to assist. And lo and behold, eventually when the meeting came up, we had representatives from about 80 different companies from one local area wanting to understand how they can get involved, how they can improve their businesses, how they can improve their bottom line. And we were also very fortunate to have one of the companies that have done a fantastic job, and I'm not just promoting them, I just want to use them as an example, Unilever, which is based out of KZN, and they've done some remarkable jobs. And I said, well, we as a department don't need to come and tell you about this business. Let one of your own tell you about this business. And I certainly hope yesterday and in the course of today that the colleagues have been sharing these case studies and these very good experiences that indicate to you very clearly it is viable to adopt these strategies and implement them and actually improve your bottom line. And I think primarily if we speak to business, we've got to speak to bottom line as well. Okay, then just in terms of institutional establishment and governance, let me move on that. The compliance, monitoring, and enforcement. Am I on? 3 minutes. Wow. I've got 3 minutes, folks. Do you think I can squeeze 5? Let's see. All right, just institutional establishment governance. We've touched on that issue, the compliance, monitoring, enforcement. I don't need to reiterate to you, I'm unfortunately one of those regulators. I'm a very pleasant, loving guy. I nurture and grow things on the one hand, and it's the same very hand that crushes on the other. So colleagues, it's always, no matter where you are in the business, take your responsibility seriously in how you embark on your business. If you neglect your duties, you are impacting on someone. And we all have a responsibility towards each other. And particularly as government and as the sector leader and the regulator within this sector, we take our jobs most seriously in terms of the compliance, monitoring, and enforcement part. Strangely enough, we've got the first sitting of the water tribunal in terms of a dispute between a water user and the department taking place in this regional office at this very moment. So people are serious about business. Colleagues, I'm not going to, local government, I'm going to skip. Agriculture, you were very, very interested in. But I think colleagues have said sufficiently enough. I need my extra minute or two, so I'm moving on. Energy production. Colleagues have been reiterating the use of desalination as a viable option. Of course, it is a viable option at very significant cost. Any option is available to you, given if you have the resources. It might become viable tomorrow if we have absolutely no water. It doesn't matter what money we need to invest, we will do it. But at this point in time, in terms of looking at the feasibility study, if we had to do one of the plants that we're looking at and providing water in the way we've understood it, you're talking to an investment of about 2.1 billion rand. And you'll only start producing that water in another 18 months. The likelihood is our drought is gone. Our Lower Tugela will be producing water, which will come online next year. We're already increasing the level of the Hazelmere Dam, which will also provide water in another 2 years. And then moving forward another, say maybe 10, 12, 15 years, we're looking at a very significant development on the Amkumazi River. So our water resources should be, reasonably available to us. And I think Dr. Naidu indicated very clearly, in terms of cost effectiveness, desalination in terms of unit reference production cost is the highest. The lowest cost, by the way, is my favorite, water conservation and demand management. I'm not going to touch on forestry now. Water resource protection, I think we've touched on some of these issues. I think from the perspective of manufacturers, it is about the effluent quality that you're releasing. And I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Fenimore, is going to be touching extensively on that, so I'm not going to go on that. The skills issue, I told you there's a critical shortage, and I do believe private sector can play a critical role in this regard as well. Okay. Colleagues, I think I'm going to maybe just get to the end. Let's not worry about the drought. Those are all the various systems. You can see what's going on. But I'm not interested in all of those. I just want to get to Makta's contact details. Chair, I'm going to take a few seconds just to conclude, with your permission. Colleagues, I'm really grateful for this opportunity. But for me, an opportunity means nothing unless you've been able to impact on or influence those that are around you. And I don't mean in a top-down fashion. I mean in an engagement. I mean in a conversation. I mean in a dialogue. And in that regard, it is business unusual within government, and we are certainly open for business. So colleagues, I would encourage you, wherever you're located within the country, within your various provinces, there are various chambers of commerce and business. Look for those opportunities for engagement. Look for dealing with improving your own situations within your own business, but critically so, look at what you could possibly contribute within the water sector in general. Colleagues and Chairperson, with that, I'd like to take the opportunity again to say thank you very much for this opportunity. Cheers.